The smell of burning rubber permeated the air when reporter Marcus Reynolds abruptly braked his car in front of 1542 Magnolia Street in Phoenix. His eyes were fixed on the rusty trailer that stood in stark contrast to the well-kept houses in the middle-class neighborhood. The anonymous tip he had received seemed too absurd, a millionaire living like a pauper in a dilapidated trailer. Marcus adjusted his tie, feeling sweat trickle down his forehead in the hot Arizona sun. At 34, after a decade covering stories for the Arizona Republic, he had developed a sixth sense for recognizing when he was about to discover something extraordinary. And that trailer with its fogged-up windows and peeling panels practically screamed mystery. He approached cautiously, observing the details that contradicted the apparent squalor of the place. A vase of rare orchids, carefully cultivated, adorned the small entrance. Next to it, a pile of newspapers from the previous day was meticulously organized with precise annotations in the margins, especially in the sections on politics and the economy. "Miss Bennett," Marcus knocked on the door, adjusting the camera hanging around his neck. The silence was broken only by the distant barking of a dog. After a few minutes, the door opened with a metallic creak. Eleanor Bennett was a short lady with perfectly combed white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through to the soul. Her clothes, although simple and worn, were impeccably clean. "Mr. Reynolds, I presume." His voice was soft but firm. "I was wondering how long it would take for the press to find out." Marcus was momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected to be recognized, let alone received so naturally. "Ow. How do you know my name?" Eleanor smiled a smile that carried decades of untold stories. "I've been following your work for years. Your reports on corruption in the health system are particularly interesting. Please come in." The interior of the trailer was a study in contrasts. Basic utilitarian furniture shared space with an impressive library of rare books. A late-model laptop was discreetly positioned next to an old typewriter. "Can I get you some tea?" Eleanor asked, heading for a small kitchen. "I have imported Earl Grey, one of the few luxuries I allow myself." While Eleanor prepared the tea, Marcus noticed several newspaper clippings carefully organized in a folder on the table. They were stories about children with rare diseases, all with happy endings after receiving expensive treatments and mysterious anonymous donors. "You're argue?" Marcus asked, his voice low and respectful. The anonymous donor. Eleanor poured the tea into fine china cups, the last vestige of her former life. "You know, Mr. Reynolds, true wealth lies not in how much money we can accumulate, but in how much we can make a difference in the lives of others." Over the next 2 hours, Eleanor shared her story. The widow of a pharmaceutical magnate, she had inherited a fortune estimated at $50 million. But it was the death of her only daughter, Victoria, from a rare disease at the age of 12 that shaped her life mission. "Money couldn't save my Victoria," Eleanor explained, her eyes watering, "but it can save other children. I decided I didn't need mansions or luxury cars. I just needed enough to survive and continue my work." Marcus discovered that Eleanor maintained a complex network of contacts in hospitals across the country, identifying cases of children who needed expensive treatments. Through a series of foundations and anonymous donations, she had already helped more than 300 families. "But why live like this?" Marcus asked, gesturing at the dilapidated trailer. "Every dollar saved on personal comfort means another chance to save a life," Eleanor replied simply. "Besides, this trailer allows me to remain anonymous and continue my work without attracting attention." At that moment, Eleanor's cell phone rang. She answered it with a serious expression, making quick notes in a notebook. "New case?" Marcus asked after she hung up. "Sophie Martinez, 8 years old, Phoenix Children's Hospital. Rare leukemia, needs an experimental treatment costing $2 million. Eleanor began typing rapidly on her laptop. The insurance company denied coverage. "He is less than 3 months." Marcus watched Eleanor work, her nimble hands moving between documents and keyboard, organizing yet another rescue operation. He realized that he was facing something much bigger than a simple newspaper story. "Miss Bennett, why did you decide to let your story be known now?" Eleanor stopped her work and looked directly at Marcus. "Because I need help, Mr. Reynolds. I'm getting old, and there are so many children in need of help. Maybe your report will inspire other people with resources to do the same." The sun was beginning to set when Marcus left the trailer, carrying not only an extraordinary story, but also a new perspective on wealth and purpose. As he drove back to the newsroom, he thought about how to tell that story in a way that did justice to the extraordinary woman he had just met. Eleanor Bennett remained in her trailer, returning to the work she had dedicated her life to. Outside, the city lights were beginning to come on, and somewhere, yet another family was about to receive the news that their child would have a second chance at life thanks to a mysterious donor who had chosen to live in an old trailer so that others could live. The investigation into Eleanor Bennett led Marcus to delve deeper into her story. In the weeks following his visit to the trailer, he spent hours at Phoenix Children's Hospital talking to doctors, nurses, and families who had been touched by the elderly woman's mysterious generosity. Dr. Rachel Martinez, head of the pediatric oncology department, welcomed Marcus into her office on a particularly busy afternoon. With 25 years' experience, she was one of the few people who knew Eleanor's true identity. "At first I thought it was some kind of scam," Rachel confessed, absent-mindedly fiddling with her coffee cup. "An old lady wanting to make million-dollar donations anonymously. It sounded too good to be true. But Eleanor, she's different. She doesn't just donate the money, she gets involved in every case." Marcus took notes furiously as Rachel shared stories about how Eleanor had created an elaborate system to identify and help children in need. Through a network of trusted social workers and doctors, she received information about urgent cases and acted quickly, always in the shadows. "I remember the case of the Wilson twins," Rachel continued. "They both needed bone marrow transplants, but the family had lost everything with previous medical bills. Eleanor not only paid for the procedures, but also guaranteed accommodation for the parents for 6 months of treatment." In the hospital corridor, Marcus met Maria Alvarez, the mother of one of the patients who had benefited. Her son Lucas had been diagnosed with a rare form of brain tumor 2 years earlier. "The doctors told us there was an experimental treatment in California," Maria explained, her hand shaking slightly as she held up a photo of Lucas. "But it cost over $1 million. We were prepared to sell our house, our cars, everything. Then one day we got a call saying that an anonymous donor would cover all the costs." Marcus discovered that Eleanor kept a makeshift office in the basement of the hospital, a small discreet space that few knew existed. There she spent hours studying medical records and coordinating with her team of lawyers and accountants to make the donations possible. The head nurse, Sandra Thompson, took Marcus there. The office was surprisingly organized with meticulously cataloged files and a wall covered in photos of smiling children, all of them survivors thanks to Eleanor's intervention. "She comes here almost every night," Sandra revealed. "Sometimes I find her sleeping on top of the archives. We try to convince her to work from home, but she insists that she needs to be close to the patients." One particularly touching detail caught Marcus' eye. In one of the drawers, Eleanor kept dozens of letters written by children and their families. Although addressed to the guardian angel, it was clear that those words of gratitude meant a lot to her. During his investigation, Marcus also discovered that Eleanor had set up a secret foundation, Victoria's Hope, in memory of her deceased daughter. The foundation not only funded medical treatments but also research into rare diseases. Dr. James Crawford, a researcher funded by the foundation, explained how Eleanor's work went beyond immediate treatments. "She understands that real change comes through research. Thanks to her funding, we are developing therapies that could save thousands of lives in the future." When Marcus returned to the trailer for a second interview, he found Eleanor in a video conference with doctors from Boston. She was discussing the case of a 5-year-old girl who needed an experimental procedure. "The insurance denied it 3 times, Eleanor explained after ending the call. "But we found a legal loophole. Victoria's Hope will pay for the treatment through a clinical research program." Marcus watched as she manipulated complex financial spreadsheets on her laptop, managing millions of dollars as easily as other people check their checking accounts. "How do you manage to keep all this a secret?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, her face tired but determined. "Anonymity is crucial, Mr. Reynolds. When people find out you have money, they change. They start making requests, creating expectations. I need to stay focused on what really matters." As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor shared more details about her operation. She had developed a complex system of offshore foundations and accounts, all legal but intricately interwoven to protect her identity. "Every penny is traceable," she assured. But the path is so complicated that few have the patience to follow it to the end. That's how I keep my privacy. Marcus realized that he was facing a much bigger story than he had first imagined. It wasn't just about a millionaire living in a trailer, it was about an entire network of hope and healing woven patiently over decades by a woman who had chosen to live simply so that others could simply live. As he left the trailer that evening, Marcus noticed a new pot of orchids at the entrance. In the center was a rare species that he recognized, the same one that decorated Victoria's grave in the local cemetery. It was a silent reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations come from the deepest losses. The knock on the trailer door was different from the usual ones. Eleanor immediately recognized the authoritative pattern of the police. She took a deep breath, draped her shawl over her shoulders, and opened the door to find two detectives from the Phoenix Police Department. "Miss Bennett, I'm Detective Michael Reese, and this is my partner, Detective Andrea Walsh. May we come in?" The tall, middle-aged man flashed his badge, his face a mask of studied professionalism. Eleanor felt her heart racing, but kept her composure. "Certainly, detectives. Can I get you some tea?" As the officers settled into the cramped space of the trailer, Eleanor noticed Marcus Reynolds standing outside, his expression a mixture of concern and guilt. The report on his story had been published that morning. "Miss Bennett," began Detective Walsh, a woman in her 40s with piercing eyes, "we've received reports of possible suspicious activity involving large financial movements through your foundations." Eleanor poured the tea with steady hands, although inside she was trembling. "I suppose that has something to do with Mr. Reynolds' story," partly replied Reese. "But we've also received information from other sources. There are suspicions of money laundering and tax evasion." Marcus, who had been invited, and intervened. "That's absurd. I've spent weeks investigating. Every penny is documented and legal." Eleanor raised her hand, silencing the reporter. "It's all right, Marcus. In fact, I expected it." She walked over to a small desk and pulled out a thick folder. "Here's all the documentation for the last 50 donations, including independent audits and legal opinions." The detective spent the next hour examining the documents while Eleanor explained her system. Each donation was carefully structured through different foundations, all legally registered and subject to strict controls. "What intrigues us," said Walsh, "is why so much secrecy? Why live like this when you clearly have the resources for so much more?" Eleanor's response was interrupted by a call on her cell phone. It was Rachel Martinez from the hospital. "Eleanor, we need you. Little Sophie has had a crisis. The family is desperate." "Detectives," Eleanor said, getting up, "can you accompany me to the hospital? Maybe then you'll understand my job better." At Phoenix Children's Hospital, they found Sophie Martinez fighting for her life in intensive care. Her devastated parents were hugging each other in the corridor. Eleanor approached them with the familiarity of someone who has lived through that pain. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," she said softly, "I am the person who is funding Sophie's treatment, and I promise that we will do everything we can to save her." The detectives watched as Eleanor coordinated with the medical team, authorized emergency procedures, and comforted the family. Her actions were precise, efficient, and deeply humane. "Anonymity isn't about hiding something wrong," Eleanor explained later as they walked through the hospital corridors. "It's about staying focused on what matters. When people find out about money, everything changes. Real needs become obscured by greed and opportunism." Walsh examined the walls of the corridor covered with photos of smiling children survivors. "How many lives have you saved?" 342 so far, Eleanor replied without hesitation. "But they're not numbers, they're stories. Like Sophie's, who is struggling inside. Like that of my Victoria, who didn't get the same chance." Marcus, who had remained silent, realized something important. "That's why you let the story come out now, isn't it? You knew it would attract unwanted attention, but there's something bigger at stake." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the ICU where Sophie was fighting for her life. "I'm getting old, and there are so many children in need of help. If my story can inspire others with resources to do the same, it's worth the risk." Detective Reese closed his notebook. "Miss Bennett, there's clearly nothing illegal going on here. But may I suggest that you accept some protection? Your story is public now, and not everyone who comes after you will have good intentions." Eleanor smiled, that smile that carried decades of wisdom. "Detective, I've spent my life protecting others. Now I need to trust that others will protect me if necessary. At that moment, an alarm sounded in the ICU. The medical staff rushed to attend to Sophie, and Eleanor moved instinctively towards the room, her face marked by the same urgency that had driven her for so many years. The detectives and Marcus watched as she disappeared through the double doors, her small, determined figure contrasting with the organized chaos of the medical emergency. In that moment, it became clear to everyone that Eleanor Bennett wasn't just an eccentric millionaire living in a trailer. She was a force of nature driven by love and determination who had found a way to turn her own pain into hope for hundreds of families. The news about Eleanor Bennett spread like wildfire through dry straw. In less than a week after Marcus' report was published, the trailer on Magnolia Street became the center of a media storm that threatened to destroy decades of confidential work. 50 more emails from television programs, sighed Andrea Walsh, now informally designated as Eleanor's protection officer. Good Morning America, Ellen, Oprah. They all want an exclusive interview. Eleanor remained focused on her laptop, coordinating the transfer of Sophie Martinez to a specialized center in Boston. The girl had survived the crisis, but her condition was still delicate. Tell them what I always tell you, detective, Eleanor replied without taking her eyes off the screen. I'm not interested in publicity. But she was interested in publicity. Reporters camped out near the trailer day and night. Letters came in by the hundreds, some with requests for help, others with business proposals, and some with veiled threats to expose supposedly dark secrets. Marcus, feeling partly responsible for the chaos, had become a constant presence, helping to filter correspondence and protect Eleanor from opportunists. Perhaps we should consider moving her to a safer location, he suggested during one particularly hectic afternoon. This trailer is my fortress, Eleanor replied firmly. Besides, I have too much work to worry about moving. The work in question had become even more urgent. Public exposure had brought an unprecedented flow of cases needing help. Eleanor spent sleepless nights assessing medical records and coordinating with her network of hospitals. One particularly tense morning, Dr. James Crawford arrived at the trailer with worrying news. Eleanor, information has been leaked about the Victoria's Hope research program. There's speculation about unauthorized experiments. The accusation was absurd. Every project funded by the foundation followed strict ethical protocols. But the damage had already been done. Investors began to question their partnerships, and hospitals feared negative association. We can't let this affect the children, Eleanor declared, her voice trembling slightly. Prepare a full audit, James. Full transparency. Meanwhile, Rachel Martinez was facing her own dilemma at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Investigative reporters were scouring hospital records, looking for connections to Eleanor. Patient confidentiality was at risk. We need to protect the families, Rachel explained during an emergency meeting in the basement of the hospital. Some are already being harassed by journalists. Eleanor listened to everything with surprising calm, but Marcus noticed how tightly her hands gripped the teacup. He knew that look was the same one he had seen when she was talking about Victoria. Perhaps, Eleanor began slowly, it's time to change our strategy. We can no longer operate in the shadows. The statement surprised everyone. Eleanor had always been adamant about maintaining anonymity. I have a proposal, she continued. Let's create an official structure. Transparent, professional, but still protecting the family's privacy. Marcus, I need your help to tell this story properly. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor worked tirelessly on restructuring her operation. The trailer became a makeshift command center where lawyers, accountants, and managers met to plan the transition. The Victoria's Hope Foundation will be the official umbrella, Eleanor explained during one of the meetings. But we will maintain smaller operational cells for cases that require absolute discretion. The transformation was not without personal cost. Eleanor rarely slept more than a few hours a night. Her health began to worry those close to her, especially when a persistent cough developed. Mrs. Bennett, you need to rest, Andrea Walsh insisted after finding her collapsed on a pile of documents. I'll rest when I know the system will continue to work without me, Eleanor replied stubbornly. The truth that few wanted to face was that Eleanor was preparing for her own mortality. Every document signed, every procedure established was part of a carefully constructed legacy. One day, while organizing old files, Eleanor came across a photo of Victoria. In the image, her daughter was smiling from her hospital bed, holding a small vase of orchids. She loved flowers, Eleanor commented softly to Marcus, who was helping her with the organization. She said they were like little miracles. Every life we save is like planting a new orchid, you know. Marcus watched as Eleanor placed the photo in a new frame, carefully positioning it next to her laptop. It was a constant reminder of the reason behind all that work. What will happen when all this is over, he asked. When the dust settles, Eleanor smiled that smile that carried both weight and hope. The story never really ends, Marcus. It just changes chapters. And our job is to make sure that the next chapter is even better than the last. The day dawned with a disturbing discovery at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Someone had tried to access the Victoria's Hope Foundation's confidential files during the early hours of the morning. The security system detected the intrusion, but the incident left Eleanor and her team on high alert. "We need to strengthen our digital protection immediately," declared Eleanor, meeting with her team in the basement of the hospital. Her face showed concern, but her eyes held that unwavering determination that characterized her. Marcus Reynolds, who now practically lived between the trailer and the hospital, noticed something different about Eleanor that morning. The cough that had been bothering her for the last few weeks seemed worse, and her hands were shaking slightly as she held her cup of tea. "I managed to trace the source of the hacking attempt," reported Kevin Chun, the recently hired digital security specialist. "It came from a server in Chicago linked to a pharmaceutical company." The revelation provoked a heavy silence in the room. Eleanor had tinkered with powerful interests over the years, especially when her donations made possible experimental treatments that Big Pharma considered economically unviable. "Dr. Martinez," Eleanor called out, her voice huskier than usual. "How is Sophie?" Rachel Martinez consulted her notes. "The transfer to Boston was a success. The new treatment is showing promising results. But Eleanor, we need to talk about you." The doctor wasn't the only one worried. Andrea Walsh, who continued to oversee Eleanor's safety, had noticed worrying changes in her routine. The elderly woman was sleeping less and less, eating poorly, and refusing to take breaks. Mrs. Bennett, Walsh intervened. "We found 3 more threatening letters this morning. We need to consider more drastic protective measures." Eleanor stood up, slowly walking over to the mural of photos that covered one of the basement walls. Hundreds of smiling faces, her children, as she called them, stared back at her. "Do you know why I chose this hospital as my base of operations?" she asked, her hand gently touching one of the photographs. "This is where Victoria spent her last days. On this very floor at that time, an ordinary pediatric ward." Marcus moved closer, noticing the photo. Eleanor was touching a girl of about 12 with brown hair and blue eyes identical to hers, smiling despite the tubes and monitors around her. "The system was broken then, just as it's broken now," Eleanor continued. "But the difference is that today we have the power to fix it, even if it's one child at a time." The meeting was interrupted by James Crawford, who rushed into the room. "Eleanor, the Foundation's audits are complete. Everything is clean, but we found something interesting in the financial analysis." The documents Crawford presented revealed a pattern. Several pharmaceutical companies had tried to discreetly sabotage Victoria's Hope projects in recent years through legal maneuvers and pressure on partner hospitals. "They're afraid," Eleanor concluded, a glint of understanding in her eyes. "It's not about money or competition. It's about the precedent we're setting. Every life we save proves that the current system is flawed." The cough interrupted her, louder this time. Rachel quickly approached, her medical instinct activated by concern. "Enough," the doctor declared firmly. "You need tests, Eleanor. Now." To everyone's surprise, Eleanor didn't protest. "You're right, Rachel. But first we need to implement the next phase of the plan." Over the next few hours, Eleanor and her team worked tirelessly on restructuring the Foundation. The model that emerged was revolutionary: a decentralized network of independent cells, each empowered to identify and help urgent cases, but all connected by a common purpose. "It's like an orchid garden," Eleanor explained, using her favorite metaphor. "Each flower is unique and needs specific care, but they are all part of the same ecosystem." As the team worked, Marcus watched Eleanor with growing admiration and concern. She had created something extraordinary, but at what personal cost? "The true test of a legacy is not how long it lasts," Eleanor told him during a moment's pause, "but how many lives it transforms while it exists." At the end of the day, when the last documents have been signed, and the new protocols established, Eleanor finally allowed Rachel to take her for tests. The sun was setting over Phoenix, casting golden shadows through the hospital windows. Marcus remained in the basement, organizing notes for his next report. On the wall, the hundreds of smiles frozen in photographs seemed to tell a story greater than words could express, a story of hope, determination, and the transformative power of a love that refused to accept limitations. Eleanor Bennett's legacy was in the making, not just in the documents and systems she had created, but in the hearts of the hundreds of families she had touched. And while the examination machines hummed a few floors up, her work continued to grow like an orchid garden blooming in the midst of adversity. Eleanor's test results arrived on a cold October morning. Rachel Martinez held the envelope with trembling hands while Eleanor maintained her usual composure in the small consulting room at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Lung cancer advanced stage, Eleanor said calmly before Rachel could even open the envelope. I've suspected it for some time, Rachel confirmed with a silent nod. 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment. Eleanor adjusted her shawl, a serene smile on her wrinkled face. Well, then we have work to do. Time is too precious to waste it with regrets. In the days that followed, Eleanor intensified her efforts to consolidate the future of the Victoria's Hope Foundation. The trailer on Magnolia Street became an even busier center of operations with constant meetings between lawyers, doctors, and administrators. Marcus Reynolds, who now considered Eleanor more than a journalistic source, watched with admiration as she conducted everything with surgical precision, even when pain made her squeeze her eyes shut or a cough interrupted her sentences. The foundation needs to be self-sustaining, Eleanor explained during one of the meetings. Each operational cell must have autonomy, but maintain the core values that brought us here. News of her condition inevitably leaked out. The media, which was already obsessed with the trailer millionaire, found new breath in the story. But Eleanor turned even this into an opportunity. If you want to interview me so badly, she told Marcus, let's use this to our advantage. Every interview will be a chance to inspire more people to join the cause. On a particularly meaningful morning, Eleanor gathered her core team in the orchid garden she had created at the back of the hospital. The place, once an abandoned space, was now flourishing with dozens of rare species. Each flower here represents a life that we touch, she explained, her voice weaker, but still carrying that characteristic inner strength. And like these orchids, our work needs to continue to flourish even when I'm no longer here to look after it. The plan Eleanor presented was ambitious. Victoria's Hope would be divided into 5 smaller foundations, each focused on a specific area: experimental treatments, medical research, family support, medical education, and the development of new medicines. The current system is broken, she reiterated, but we can't just criticize it. We need to create viable alternatives. Over the next few weeks, while her body weakened, her determination only grew. Eleanor worked tirelessly to document every aspect of her operation, creating detailed manuals and personally training each team leader. Sophie Martinez, now recovering in Boston, sent daily videos showing her progress. Eleanor watched them over and over, finding strength in the small victories. See, she said to Andrea Walsh during one of her safety sessions, that's why all this work is worth it. Every smile regained, every family reunited. The trailer, which had been her refuge for so long, began to receive regular visits from families she had helped over the years. They came not to ask for more help, but to offer support and gratitude. The real miracle, Eleanor confided to Marcus during one of her last interviews, is not the money we donate or the treatments we fund. It's seeing how kindness multiplies, how each person we help becomes capable of helping others. In her last month of life, Eleanor finally allowed them to turn her trailer into a small museum, not as a monument to her, but as a symbol of what a single determined person can achieve. I want people who visit this place to understand that you don't have to be a millionaire to make a difference, she explained. Each one of us has something to offer. In the last week of her life, Eleanor received news that made her smile. Through her tears, 3 big businessmen, inspired by her story, had decided to set up similar foundations in other parts of the country. Did you see that? She whispered to Marcus, who was holding her hand in the hospital bed. The garden keeps growing. Eleanor Bennett died on a quiet December morning, exactly as she had lived, without fanfare, but surrounded by purpose. At her funeral, hundreds of orchids were brought spontaneously by families. She had helped turning the ceremony into an impromptu garden of gratitude. Marcus, in his last article about Eleanor, wrote, "Some call it luck to be born rich. Others call it a privilege. Eleanor Bennet proved it's a responsibility, one she fulfilled to her last breath." Eleanor's legacy continued to flourish. The trailer on Magnolia Street became a symbol of hope, welcoming visitors from all over the country. The Victoria's Hope Foundation expanded to other states, saving more and more lives. But perhaps her greatest legacy was the lesson she left behind, that true wealth lies not in how much we have, but in how much we are willing to share. Like the orchid she loved so much, Eleanor proved that even in the most unlikely conditions, beauty and kindness can flourish, transforming lives and inspiring generations to come.